Hello guys, and glad to have you on board again today. After terminating the first technical assessment we've made into this progression toward risk management and teaching you my trading strategy, today we're going to start the first parallel thing we're going to deal with, which is just psychological management and how you'll get to mature into trading and stuff like that. So today, before even getting into the actual real deal, which we're going to be doing right by the next video, don't worry about it. There's not going to be a 5 set of video of introductions and stuff like that. But today is going to be a little bit of a blah blah thing, but I totally think this is absolutely necessary in order to progress. But it's more like making sure everyone is standing on the same level before we actually move into the next ones, because we're going to need a little bit of neurobiology knowledge in here. And I totally understand that some people might have it and some others might totally be navigating into blurry territory out there. So it's more for equaling people purposes right there. So if you do have a biocore background or whatever stuff like that, I mean, you can definitely move out to the next one. You're going to totally be aware of what's going to be said out there. It's just that for others, I think it's absolutely necessary that we get to make some kind of a review, because I'm going to be using some complex stuff. And if you don't really understand what's at play, then I think it's getting pointless at some point to get further in time. So you might really gain from understanding what's at play, how these things processes each other, how biologically speaking, whatever happens into your brain just makes you absolutely unprepared for trading. And that, whether you like it or not, we're all born this way. So this just like heritage from evolution, and basically, whether you like it or not, you're going to have to work your way out of this, and it will take a shit ton of time. But either you take that for granted and you say, all right, you just said it, that's great, or you just listen to this course and I'll basically try to explain you in the most logical possible way, without getting too much beneath the surface, how these things actually work out into your brain. So you can at least understand the way we're going to be using, when I'll get to the actual real stuff on psychology, how to overcome these problems and stuff like that. You're going to understand that there's a logic behind it, and it's not just randomness. It's actually been done in real purpose to trigger some specific parts of your brains that gonna need to be changed in order to be an efficient trader over time. That doesn't mean you're gonna be better at one trade, whatever. It's really all about getting you prepared for thousands of trades and how you're gonna be managing them in the most profitable way, avoiding, most importantly, to make mistakes. Because just like we said into technical stuff, it's not about making the good decision. It's just about preparing yourself to avoid making biased decisions and stuff like that. This is what the psychology is going to be all about. So anyway, enough talking. Today I'm going to be using a PowerPoint supporters once again, because much better for you to understand those things, even though this is definitely not going to be a biological course today, but just, yeah, like I said, scratching the surface for you to absolutely understand the complex stuff that's going on. And obviously, if you are interested in any way of what's going to be said today, you have plenty of information around the web to really dig a lot deeper into this. It's absolutely passionating sector, and I'm definitely passionate with that. I wish I could talk about it for hours, but I'm going to try standing still and not too much talky and sticking to the essentials out there. Let's get it started. All right, so here's your brain. Congratulations. I hope you do understand that. You already know that, but anyway, so what we're going to focus on today is the 3-layer system into your brain, starting from the one that has been highlighted in here, which is basically your spinal cord area in here. Oh, Jesus, let me just gather my stuff. What the hell's going wrong? Okay, here we are, the spinal cord area in here, and the one that has been highlighted in red in here, which is your hindbrain, or the area that at some point people were calling reptilian brain, okay, because of course, this is the area in which some of the core functions of your brains are handled. So we're going to care about this area, just like we're going to care in one area in each specific area of the brain. We consider 3 ones of them. So the primitive brain in here, hindbrain, whatever, reptilian, call it however you want, just that's how it is. The intermediate limbic system, which is where we're going to talk a lot, because that's basically the intermediate functions of regulatory systems and stuff like that. And basically what we have on top of it is the neocortex, or multiple cortex lobes and stuff like that. And the one we're basically going to focusing a lot on today, the frontal lobe. So 3 layers, and we basically start with the most primitive one in here, which is obviously the so-called reptilian brain. Okay, so it's composed by 2 things. Okay, so you've got your spinal cord entering in here, okay, creating the brainstem, in which you have the medulla in here, which is just an area. Okay, you got the pons right on top of it. All right, we're just gonna stand still in here for the most important stuff. Don't really go for too much biology. What matters is that we're not gonna care a lot about this area. Let's considering it out that way. It handles some actually core automatic functions like cardiac and respiratory. You definitely need your fucking heart to beat blood through your body, otherwise you're just going to instantly die, and you don't want to be doing this in a conscious way. So it has to be done with some automated stuff and stuff like that. So it's important for you to understand not what the brainstem is composed by, medulla, pons, whatever. It's just the functions that has been derived out there to understand what really is at play into this primitive brain. Okay, so automatic cardiac management, just like automatic respiratory. You definitely don't want to be dealing with that in a conscious way. Okay, so the second part, which is the one we actually truly care about, and the one that has been highlighted in red in here, which is the cerebellum. It's like just a tiny little version of your brain that we've inherited from, of course, evolution and stuff like that. These are the first brain structure that managed evolution and some adaptivity of living beings and how they evolve through time. So most of the species evolution has happened into the cerebellum, but though this one is obviously far more complex than the brainstem, which is taking care of just making sure you're going to breathe in, breathe out, and pumping up the blood. Okay, it's really that simple. Of course, it's much more complex if we were getting into this, but we don't need too much details. Cerebellum is what we care about. This is where we get motor control. As you can see, as species have managed their way out of water, they had to crawl and climb and whatever, and we got into much more complex motor functions. And this is where these things have been created by evolution. So we create more complex motor control. But just like cardiac and respiratory, these things are done totally automatically, totally unconsciously. You definitely don't have absolutely no control over this area. So in order to get you understand how this thing actually works out, the neuroplasticity, which is basically the word we use to define how much you can change something into your brain. The neuroplasticity of this hindbrain, or so-called reptilian brain, is really, really low, which means things still happen out there. Some neurons connection can be altered and stuff like that. Some new can be created or reformed. But most importantly, most of it is like frozen. Okay, like you're not going to be changing a lot of what happens into your reptilian brain. Most of it is going to be fixed by approximately 3 months of a living experience outside the uterus. So lots of these things are prepared inside the uterine level, of course, and it's basically, this part of the brain is basically mature when you get to be born. It's just that there's going to be a massive change when you get confronted to your first environmental changes, when you're basically going to born and get out of mama and discover the world. This is where you're going to be confronted to your first actual experience with the world, the external world. And in that perspective, during the first 3 months of living, there's huge cataclysm going on into the cerebellum. Basically, like 99% or more than 90% of neural connections made intrautero is going to be mostly reformed or destroyed or whatever during the first 3 months of a living experience outside, in the outside world. But after this 3 months period, this thing is getting like frozen. It still changes and evolves, but very, very, very slowly. Very weak neuroplasticity. Okay, important that you get to understand. But the thing is that on top of this, there is a really huge advantage. With neuroplasticity, which comes with an advantage. The advantage is the absolute fast response. It's definitely one of the fastest way to manage things. This is, of course, meant to be done for automatic purposes, all right? You don't want to think too much before breathing in and out or pumping blood. You definitely want these things to be as simple as possible, as efficient in terms of evolution, biological evolution. So this part of the brain is like something that we've managed to inherit from years and billions of years of evolutions. So these things are actually, or millions of years of evolutions actually, But yes, these things are masterpieces of evolutionary efficiency. So this is all about it. Therefore, it's weak in terms of neuroplasticity because it's essential to our living conditions. Okay, absolutely necessary. But cerebellum doesn't just care about motor control, it also controls part of our emotions. And basically what's important out there is that it takes care of the emotions we're going to experience in the first weeks of our living, and specifically the first 3 months. Okay, and this is why we generally say cerebellum is considered defining our primary personality. Okay, most importantly, because the first things you're going to experience as a newborn baby is a shit ton of stress. You just basically gone out of something that you got used to for 9 months, grown into, and basically, bam, you brought it out there. You need to breathe on your fucking own. You need to be fed. It's a freaking piece of shit compared to what you were experiencing in this still moving environments and evolving things. Okay, in utero life isn't that simple. It's way more complicated than people think it is, but still it's far easier to manage than whatever happens out there later on. So definitely a lot of complex stuff goes in. And we say that generally the primary personality of a children, or a baby in this case, is defined by 4 major stress response. The thing is that many people tend to believe that they're born with one, but we actually aren't. When we get to experience the first environmental changes, getting out of mama, basically a child will oscillate between those 4 conditions in order to manage stress, getting fed, whatever, sleep, whatever they're going to be doing and dealing with those 4 options: fighting, denial, calm, and inhibition. And basically they're going to oscillate between the 4, trying to find slowly but steadily the most efficient one. And that is totally dependent on environmental conditions and stuff like that. So this is why 90% of the connections are basically created, reformed, solidified, destroyed in all of those very intense 3 months first experience of living. Okay, so what matters out of this is that basically after 3 months you're going to emerge with one dominating thing. That doesn't mean the others are not at play. They definitely always will. Every one of us has the ability to use fight, denial, calm, and inhibition. It's just that after 3 months one of these pathways will definitely take on over the others. It will have significantly more solidified neural connections that will significantly favor this type of reaction when confronted to stress later on in life, and even as a 30-year-old boy or a 40-year-old adult and stuff like that, even as a 90-year-old human being, you'll still be led to those early 3 months decisions that have been made into your cerebellum. So you're trying to fight this thing, just don't nearly even try. That doesn't even make sense, because whatever happens out there is very weak neuroplasticity. Basically, the only way you could eventually alter these things would be drilling into your fucking brain. Okay, this area of the brain has been put into the safest possible way in which human beings could place it, right behind your neck, the area in which basically you're trying to protect as much as possible. Okay, just as opposed to, of course, the frontal lobe, which is totally exposed to shocks and stuff like that. So this is where we handle the stuff that keeps us alive, and stress response is one of those things. Okay, so you need to understand that whatever happens out there is not something you can act upon. You're definitely not going to change whatever is made into your primary personality. Just get to deal with it. We're going to need to highlight whichever of those first initial stress response can be triggered by your own personality. This is definitely one of those 4 that is normally favored. Each and every one of us has a different way of reacting to stress. And like I said, basically it has been defined at your 3 months living experience. If you think you're smart enough to change that, don't be. We're not going to change that. We're just going to have to work with it and make sure that we overcome the problem. So we're going to talk about this one later on when we move to the next layer of our brain, okay, which is the limbic system. This one is crucial, obviously, because like we said, it's the intermediary way in between the cerebellum we've just talked about and the frontal lobe, which we're going to be talking in next. So it is the link between the two. Information as it comes from the spinal cord and gets sent through it, okay, this is the communication hub of your brain, basically the first accessible area, the closest one really geographically speaking, is of course the cerebellum. So information can be processed way faster out there, and information gets tested out there first. So anything that comes into your brain generally comes first through the cerebellum, checking if whether or not it triggers some patterns through your neural networking system, and then gets processed through later stages further away into the brain, deeper into the brain. But just think of it as a tree, okay? Information goes in, gets processed by the larger branches, and gets relayed to some more lighter branches until they actually get right to the end, the external factors, which is cortex, which would be the equivalent, even though this is totally not possible to make this parallel, to your leaves and stuff like that, the external areas, the volume of the brain, just like the volume of a tree could be, more importantly, due to leaves. Okay, anyway, so intermediate part of your brain, absolutely crucial to understand. There is an area in here that I have highlighted, which is really tiny, and it's really important for you to understand how teeny this thing is. It's just the size of an almond, so it's really that small, and that's basically why it's been called amygdala, by the way, but that's what it is about. Okay, so our limbic system is composed by 4 major elements. They're not just them, but of course in here we're going to make things simple and stick to the essentials so you understand the role, basic global role of this brain area. Limbic system has generally been called the siege for emotional brain or stuff like that. So it's definitely all about these things, because basically the most important structure into this brain is this area you see in here, okay, connected to the center part of your brains in here, where we're going to find thalamus and therefore hypothalamus, which you see in here, and the pituitary gland, which is basically with those two, and they're not just these two, okay? There are other glands, basically thyroid, adrenal glands and stuff like that. So all of those things are meant to be the endocrinology system in our body, which is actually what's going to regulate most of our feelings and emotions and stuff like that. You're going to feel tired. When you say, I feel something, it's generally due to a hormonal stuff that is triggering endocrinal behaviors, which is going to either increase tensions on your muscles and stuff like that. All of this comes from hormones and endocrinological behaviors. So what basically defines how those things will behave is decided into the thalamus, in the hypothalamus, and the pituitary, most importantly. If you really want to understand how this process works, and we're basically, I think, probably going to make another of these shows on neurobiology and eventually even neurochemistry, but probably later on into the series of video for more intermediate or professional stuff, because we're definitely going to have to talk about the hormonal system and the endocrinal system, but later on, okay? Today we're really going to scratch the surface of neurobiology so you get to understand the psychological processes and what actually is at play to trigger them. So thalamus and hypothalamus, and therefore secondly the pituitary, is like the Saint Graal. It's the thing that basically sets your emotions. Let's make it simple. It's where the hormonal stuff gets regulated. So this is what decides what you're going to feel. Okay? It's really made it simple in here, but I mean, I don't want to go down more complicated stuff, because yes, it is fairly important for you to understand that a mature trader, someone that has been confronted to trading environment for long enough, will have totally different way of managing fear and anxiety than a normal human being. So I'm definitely not managing fear and anxiety as most external normal human beings. That also brings advantages and disadvantages. It's definitely not a perfect stuff to say, all right, I don't fear and I'm not anxiety. Jesus, motherfucker, it has some downside effects as well. It's not perfect. But for trading, managing fear and anxiety is absolutely crucial. And most people are actually not familiar with it, which means you're going to have to totally change and swipe out some very bad behaviors. And these things you need to understand that are actually physically wired into your brain, into this amygdalofugal pathway. So you're going to need to work this shit and to rework it. But just like we've seen on the previous thing, okay, our primitive brain has a very weak neuroplasticity. In here, we do have more of a intermediate, okay? The cortex neuroplasticity, and specifically the frontal cortex, is at best in the brain. This is where most of the connections can be created, edited, reformatted, and all of those things. But yes, into the limbic system, the neuroplasticity exists. Okay, and in this perspective, we can change things, and we're going to work so hard into this amygdalofugal pathway, but in a much more detailed version. So today is an introduction, so we can actually pile up more complex information later on, but you need to understand how this thing works, because we're going to talk about this shit a lot. Okay, why do we talk about it? Because there's basically actually a huge fight into your brain between amygdala and hippocampus. One of them is due to the fact that the stria terminalis makes its whole fucking way around the hippocampus to reach out and connect the amygdala to the hypothalamus. And in that perspective, they're somehow creating a very complex relationship of inhibitory stuff, which means amygdala and hippocampus have totally different ways of managing emotions. Amygdala is basically managing fear and anxiety and directly accessing to thalamic functions, trying to basically create the true feeling of fear, okay? Your gut's feeling weird. All of those things are actually endocrinal response to amygdala sending direct signals to hypothalamic functions, okay? And hippocampus on its end has a totally different way of doing and managing emotions and processing them. The hippocampus is basically looking at interconnections and feedback loops, somehow of a pattern detector into your brain that is going to say, all right, I receive this information and this information and this information, and it feels like it happened already. So maybe I should scroll through memory to figure out if there is something I can deal with that. And if these things happen many times in the past, then maybe I should solidify the memorial connections for this. So it's actually, so many people tend to say hippocampus is memory part of the brain. That's definitely wrong, actually. It's just the component that is essential to memory formation, but it's definitely not making the memories. It's just somehow the pre-packaging stuff. It's like taking things all together, trying to detect patterns and sending the information elsewhere in the brain, and specifically to be dealt with into the frontal lobe, but not just about it, okay? And it's really important that for you to understand, okay, that these things has connections to multiple areas of the brain. It's really like an interconnecting stuff, and it is crucial. What we want is a lot more hippocampal reactions than amygdalan access to thalamic functions. So this is what we care about in trading. Reformatting this amygdalofugal pathway, favoring hippocampal reactions over amygdalan ones. And it takes a shit ton of time to work this out because of a still possible neuroplasticity, way more than with forging our cerebellum, but obviously it's going to be far more difficult than working around the cortex area, which we're going to see right next. Okay, so you need to understand how these things, there is definitely a battle between amygdala and hippocampus. They try to inhibit each other, and therefore we're going to try influencing one of the two, favoring hippocampal reactions over amygdala. But it's not just the end of it, okay? As the hippocampus takes over, more importantly and more favorably than the amygdalan response, that's great. We've managed something great. But this is not just about it. That means we're going to process information and work the upper layers of our brain to process information later on. We're going to call for short-term memory and long-term memory, trying to figure out patterns, and then trying to make connections, work all of these things out, trying to make sense of it into our different cortex areas, okay? But it can only take place if you favor hippocampus reaction over amygdala, okay? Because accessing thalamic function is key for your feelings and therefore your emotion. This is why we call this limbic system the emotional brain, and this is how it basically functions. It's way more complex than that, but today is just an introduction, okay? If you really have been interested in any way in what has just been said, there's a lot more to dig into if you really want to understand all about it, okay? So now we get to the third layer of a brain, the external. Though if you understood what we said previously, we basically have stored our core function into an area in which it's the safest locations for this in the brain, closest as possible to the spinal cord, so fast decision-making processes and stuff like that. Really core information driven, and it's frozen after 3 months of experience. And then we get this intermediate brain, which is managing the way information is processed and emotions are felt, and sending messages to hypothalamic functions that will manage your entire endocrinal behavior. Okay, and in this perspective, we do have this hippocampus, that is managing and organizing information transfer, pattern detection, and memory transfers throughout the external layers of the brain, the cortex or neocortex, and the one we actually care the most about, the frontal lobe. There are multiple lobes into this brain. The temporal lobe is mostly taking care of auditions purposes. Occipital lobe is taking care of vision. Occipital lobe is basically right at the back. Okay, temporal lobe, just like you get it, is on the tempo, and parietal lobe is taking care of associating things. And there is a strong connection between hypothalamic. I'm gonna get to it. Between hippocampus and the parietal lobe, just like there is with the frontal lobe. Okay, if you see this cut vision we've had, let's just look at it. Okay, as you can see, bang, huge connection to the frontal lobe. So it's basically a huge and complex association between parietal lobe and frontal lobe that's at play with the hippocampus. And this is what we care the most about, because frontal lobe is where we're going to rational and analytic, we're going to take care of rational and analytic functions. This is basically what the frontal lobe does. It's actually way more complex than that, but once again, just scratching the surface. If you really want to go down the frontal lobe's functions, real functions, there's plenty of absolutely passionating studies out there. But just making the essentials for you to move on to the next videos in here. Okay, so what we actually going to be caring about is not just the rational and analytic function, because what we actually want out there is the regulatory functions of the frontal cortex, which is pretty much located into a much frontal area, which is basically the real front of our brain, the most exposed thing. Okay, when you hit the wall, it's basically what you're destroying out there. So if you think about it in an evolutionary perspective, this is the area that is going to be the most important for us into trading, to manage consistent information processing. And this is basically the most exposed thing we've got in our brain. So in evolutionary perspective, that's the thing we consider the least useful for our survival. Okay, so yeah, in a pure survival way, then, I mean, you just hit the wall and you actually damage this part of the brain. Okay, so this is where there is the strongest neuroplasticity. That's also the reason why it is the most aging part of our brain. Reason why we so much call all the old peoples of us the frontal people. They basically have degenerating neural connections in the frontal lobe because of a very strong neuroplasticity all around the life, which means entropy is destroying some of those connections, whatever. It's way more complex to get into aging the frontal lobe, but you need to understand that neuroplasticity is somehow correlated to aging, and therefore this is where we get the strongest neuroplasticity into the frontal lobe. Much more neuroplastic than actually the limbic system, which is still possibly could be evolving, and definitely is, but much slower than the frontal cortex. So if you understand how this thing works, 3 layers, this one can't change any fucking thing about it. This thing you can change. It still takes some time, but it can be much faster in terms of response. It just comes out of repetitiveness. So we're going to have to make things a lot and consistently to actually rapidly influence the frontal lobe. But the frontal lobe, due to its complex connectiveness with the limbic system, specifically through the hippocampus, will actually it's going to be our way into this amygdalofugal connections we've talked about. Okay, so we're going to work our frontal lobe to get access to these connections, and we're going to go deeper into this into the next video anyway. So this prefrontal cortex is actually managing emotional regulation, impulse control, just like long-term planning, and not the least, gratification postponement. And this is something we're going to talk a lot, because gratification postponement is a true big thing for impatience biases. This is actually one of the big factors that defines our impatience and how we can actually work our way around it. So to work around impatience, we're going to have to work the limbic system, and in order to do it, we're going to have to work with the cortex, and this is the area of the cortex we're going to work around to actually make sure that we influence limbic functions. Okay? Long-term planning, that makes absolute sense that you to understand that this part of the frontal lobe is basically going to be really important to efficiently build plans and construct strategies and stuff like that. So for trading, god damn it, it's going to be absolutely interesting and absolutely important. So we're going to have to work and train hard this part of the brain. This is why through time you get much better at planning things, okay? A trader is a fucking planner, is someone who has planning so many things, not just in trading, in life, and all of those things. A trader is someone who builds plan, and it gets fairly natural to do such a thing. I'm actually not even thinking about these things. They've become automatic because some of these processes have been switched to some more automatic system through time, and it took a freaking shit ton of time to get there. But it started with frontal lobe manipulation, and I'll teach you some tips and tricks on how to overcome your brain and helping new connections into these areas. Okay, so this is why we make this thing today, so we don't have to pull this one into the next videos that will be long anyway on its own. Impulse control, which is great because this is where you're going to have and this is a specific area of the frontal lobe and prefrontal cortex specifically, in which we deal with inhibitory management of specifically the amygdala. So this is something we're going to work a lot into working amygdalofugal connections in here as well, but this one also can manage somehow reduction using neurotransmitters to actually reduce connectivity from the spinal cord to the cerebellum. So impulse control is absolutely a huge part of a brain because it actually helps us saying, all right, shit Sherlock, there's no emergency, takes time, okay? Impulsive behaviors can be manipulated through this specific area. So you're gonna have to work a shit lot out of it to progress into trading, and we're gonna talk about it. I'll teach you the things into the next video. And emotional regulation, of fucking course. This is where we're gonna store the patterns that we've detected through hippocampus detections and agglomeration. So parietal lobe and frontal lobes work their way into detecting emotional patterns. That is something we're going to work and talk a lot about, because of course, as you're going to detect and manage those patterns, you're going to store information into memory, and therefore when these patterns repeat, you're going to rapidly identify them and call different areas of the brain, most importantly impulse control. So what a trader does into its brain is actually rapidly regulating emotions, saying, okay, I feel too much emotion right now, just calm down, calm the fuck down, just don't trigger amygdala right now, let's just think for a second, is there a true emergency at the moment? No, so calm the fuck down, we're gonna think first, even if it takes a lot more time to process, okay? This is absolutely crucial for you to understand. This brain takes a lot more fucking complex circuitry and functions. So it takes energy and it takes time. This is the reason why in an evolutionary way of thinking about stuff, this is definitely not the most appropriate stuff for survivability. This is the reason why we put it right into the fucking front of our head. So really an inefficient way of processing information regarding time and energy, but that's what makes us human, okay? So the thing with this part of the brain, huge neuroplasticity, which means absolutely crucial in terms of environmental conditioning. This is the part of the brain we can rapidly access, even though it still takes not seconds to work it out. But the thing is that just a huge trauma can significantly alter this part of the brain and the way it functions. So it's really strong in terms of neuroplasticity, and it has pros and cons. But the pros is that we're going to be able to rapidly change some behaviors out there. The cons is that we must not let traumas get out there, because that can significantly deteriorate the progress we've made previously, okay? So actually the thing about this area is that we need to make sure that we're working around it as much as possible. We need to make sure that we grant enough time for this part of the brain to work, okay? And it also, even though it might sound stupid, to bring a lot of energy out there. And this is where we're going to talk a lot about attention later on. Attention has a huge impact on the energy and time consumptions of this part of the brain. If your attention is really there, then actually your frontal cortex gets way more efficient at dealing with informations. Okay, neurotransmitters working way more efficiently, so information, even though the circuitry is freakingly complex as hell, it's going to work much better with attention. And of course, as attention declines, you'll see the frontal lobe being way less efficient at doing this stuff. Okay, and like we said, gratification postponement is absolutely crucial to patience biases, which we're going to talk about next. So that's it with our third layer for a brain. We actually need to work this one a lot because this is what's going to bring us consistency. The consistency we want as traders. Remember that the strategy and its technical part is meant to bring rational decision-making processes and stuff like that, and to make sure that things are actually as repeatable as possible. As you build a structure of decision-making processes, you gather informations, you process them and stuff like that, okay? But it also has to mature as well into your brain, and you definitely don't want the limbic system to take over on decision-making processes. You definitely want the cortex to deal with this information with the most efficient possible way, and therefore this is why you want to favor prefrontal cortex decision-making processes more than anything else. And therefore, if you want to favor this, you're going to have to create some boundaries, some solidified neural connections leading to this area of the brain being efficiently as used as possible, not too much. And therefore, this is why we switch to the next part. Absolutely crucial. You need to get to understand this thing, okay? It's kind of a global schematic of what's at play in here, okay? As you get any stimuli or whatever through receptors, which is basically in here your eyes scrolling into a chart and gathering information, we do not have a lot of issues out there. As long as you have good eyes, you shouldn't be seeing information that doesn't belong there or whatever, okay? I hope you do not have hallucinations and stuff like that. So normally perceptions should be fine. Or sensory perception should be fine. But this is where the tricky part comes in, okay? So we're going to talk a lot about perception into the second part of the psychological perspective, which we're probably going to be into the intermediate progression in the strategy, in which we're going to talk about the endocrinal system and how it can significantly alter perceptions, perception and also attention. But yeah, this is something for later, okay? What we care about, what we've cared about today is talking about the memory part of this thing, okay? And specifically through the hippocampus, okay? Which is and going to be seriously impacted by attention as well, okay? Because attention can seriously decrease hypothalamic functions and therefore decreasing the probability of efficiency of our hippocampus to process information, sending it through the external part of the brain, and therefore at some point your evolutionary processes will say, okay, it takes too long for this decision-making process, burning too much energy, shut the fuck up, I'm gonna trigger amygdalan response or eventually cerebellum type of response if there is a feel of emergency. Because that's what we've talked about today, a little bit of intention, the decision-making and response selection. At some point, something real dangerous can happen into your brain. If you end up feeding amygdalan response to your hypothalamic function, it's going to create an overshit ton of endocrinal response that is going to favor at some point emergency. Which means when too much fear is triggered, at some point there is a chemical reaction, which we're going to be talking in the endocrinal system podcast in much more detail, that is going to create the feel of emergency. Absolutely creating it out of nothing, which means, I mean, what the fuck can bring an emergency in front of a computer? You're definitely not going to die. It's not a matter of life and death in front of a computer. It's never going to be. But at some point, bringing too much stress and anxiety by triggering too much hypothalamic functions through the amygdala, we're actually going to end up with the emergency situation of, shit, man, do something right now. And if that's whatever happens, you know what the fuck is going wrong. We're just going to totally bypass this thing, totally bypass memory and go immediately from perception through cerebellum type of decision-making processes, absolutely dangerous, because there's not even a glimpse of attention that is going to be necessary out there. It's a total bypass of memory, and therefore just give a fuck about all the rules you've learned. You're definitely not going to follow them. It's going to be absolutely in subconscious decision-making process. Hugely dangerous and can be very costly in some cases, because you're rapidly going to get from stimuli receptor perception, and this can be a severe perception alteration in here, because basically information has to be processed as fast as fucking possible. So if we didn't gather all the information, just don't give a fuck. We're going to take what feels like relevant. Is there a crocodile about to eat me right now? All right, I'm doing something. I'm taking the trade. What the fuck is going on? I mean, yeah, there's no crocodile to eat you out there. So it is totally, absolutely stupid cognitive processes out there. But still they happen. And they happen because of too much amygdalin stimuli into the hippocampus. Into the hypothalamus. Okay? So you need to understand these things. In order to get to rational response, you need to take time to work memory. In order to work memory, we need to trigger the hippocampus to communicate with the external layer of the brain, making things a lot more sense of our emotions rather than just triggering action through them. And we actually got it all, okay? So that's what this is. Attention is the latest factor we need to talk about in here. Attention is very important into the way the actual neurochemistry works. And the problem with attention is that it's actually a lot more fluctuating than people think it is. Basically, attention reaches out its peaks around 45 minutes at doing something, and basically it starts declining later on at a faster pace than the growing thing, which means generally after one and a half hour, you're basically totally less attentive to whatever the fuck you're doing. So that's why generally when I teach you trading, I tell you, all right, work around for an hour. Eventually try to take another 10 minutes if you really need to finish something, but don't go anywhere beyond that, because anything that you're going to be doing later on is going to seriously decrease attention. And attention has a lot of impact through either perceptions, the way memory is efficiently working. Remember that less attention means less effective neurochemistry connections, oh shit. Oh, sorry, I got a spider on. Oh shit. Okay, anyway. That's what this is, okay? Attention is absolutely crucial, and attention can also impact at some point cerebellum and amygdalin response can be favored to be called as being way more efficient as the brain does. Okay, when you get tired, you're gonna say, all right, fuck it, I need to move it to something else. Attention is out. Just trigger the fastest possible action and just get the fuck out of here. Okay, that is going to be a huge impactor in terms of decision-making processes. So this acts as a parallel. You need to understand that we're going to work this one out, okay, as a neurochemistry, endocrinal way, and a neurobiological connecting wiring type of stuff. Definitely working around this amygdalofugal connection, okay? But this thing is the wiring thing of the thing, and we're going to have to work with attention in parallel, because if you fuck up attention as you work this, you're probably going to have a deteriorating effect, okay? So just to make sure that your progress isn't going destructive, you definitely need to make sure that you're not going to get obsessive with your trading. Therefore, if you work more than an hour in a row, take a pause, do something fucking else. I don't know, read a book, watch a movie, look at a YouTube video, whatever, but do something else. Otherwise, attention is going to seriously decrease, and it's not going to catch up until you actually do something else and focus on something else, okay? It's not just about closing your eyes and be right back at work 5 minutes later. It's really all about cutting off and moving to something else to eventually come back at it later. I suspect you could do 2 or 3 focusing areas into trading a day. More is going to be a lot more complicated than that. Okay, and if it's not separated by some other stimuli, then it's definitely not going to work. All right, that's going to be it. We have more than enough information to switch to conclusion. All right, so if you understand what's at play today and the core information, your brain has 3 layers. Okay, there is a primitive part of your brain, absolutely no fucking control over this one. If you think you can change anything like that, I mean, it's totally frozen after 3 months of your experience. So just deal with it. Figure out what your early response to stress is. Either it's fear, it's run away, okay, denial, or it's eventually just doing nothing. All right, just standing still, calm, okay, or eventually totally inhibit. Inhibit means basically the dead mouse, okay? You're in front of the cat can totally eat you, and you're basically overwhelmed with information, and bam, you just freeze. So you have one of those 4 responses that is favored, and that's just fucking written into your brain. Try to change it, not gonna work. Try to make it even more simple, even more complicated, not gonna work. Just work around with it. Be able to highlight what your favoring reaction to stress is, so you can make sure that you rationalize it when it shows up. We're gonna work a fucking lot about it, and in order to make it, you need to make sure that you favor, okay, your amygdalofugal pathway to favor hippocampal reaction over amygdalan reactions to access hypothalamic functions, because otherwise these ones can very dangerously at some point get to favor cerebellum to take over and just totally bypass the external factors, the external layer of your brain, which is the cortex, in which we're going to work a lot, because this is where the neuroplasticity is the most accessible for us to work around. And we actually going to need to work out the external layers first to actually being able to access this amygdala function, the amygdalofugal connection, and the striatum terminalis. In order to work around these neural connections, we actually going to need to work out the inner layers, okay? The outer layers, okay? And we're going to work those outer layers out, the 4 pillars we've talked about, okay? We're going to talk a lot about gratification postponement for the patient's thing, just like the impulse control. These things are really going to be dealt with specifically with the fear of impatience biases we're going to talk about, or impatience biases we're going to talk about. The fear of uncertainty is going to be talked and massively about the emotion control part of this thing, which is going to be absolutely important for us to create patterns of emotions to detect early activities that can somehow down the corner lead to some cerebellum actions, which we just never wants to happen, okay? And in the same time, we're going to work our long-term planning skills, being able to, over time, being way more efficient at planning stuff, creating strategies and stuff like that, because that's going to help you building your plans much, much faster. That being said, you know all about it right now, but just saying it out loud would have made not that much sense, right? I've been talking for 30 minutes. Yes, of course, it's been long, blah, blah, you know me. But anyway, now I think you actually truly understand what's at play. What are the complex relationships, all the fucking wiring into your brain that actually makes it totally understandable. We're going to work around all these things, but now you understand why. And I think it's absolutely necessary that you know that. So I felt like I had to make this first introduction into psychology before actually jumping into the real stuff, how to overcome and work around your natural 2 biases that's going to fuck up your trading experience in the beginning: fear of uncertainty and fear and impatience biases. Anyway, that's going to be it for the day. So let me just give you a quick recap. Let me just bring this one up. Okay, so here it is. Okay, so this is the sum up of today's core information. You actually need to make sure all of this is totally mastered before you move into the next video, in which we're going to get into the real deal, how to overcome those 2 biases. That being said, I wish you guys a pleasant day.